In March 2019, the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands faced a nightmare in daylight. A man boarded a tram and began shooting indiscriminately, leaving the city frozen under lockdown. Utrecht's tram network moves students, workers, and retirees between neighborhoods every morning. On that day in March 2019, 4 passengers would never return. 49-year-old Rinke Terpstra, honored after his death for protecting other passengers. 19-year-old Roos Verschoor, remembered as a student with a bright future. A 28-year-old man, and a 74-year-old man who later died of his injuries. 2 of the victims were named publicly, while the other 2 were generally described only by age and residence, as their families chose privacy. Each loss was deeply felt, and their ordinary routines ended that morning. The rest of the story explains how this became possible. The man responsible was Gökmen Tanis, born in Turkey in 1981 and raised largely in the Netherlands. He moved with his family at a young age, settling in Utrecht. Over time, his life took a path of instability that repeatedly brought him into contact with police and the justice system. By 2019, Dutch records showed a man with a long history of brushes with the law. He had been prosecuted for violent incidents, for threats, and for firearm possession. In 2013, he was arrested after firing a weapon during a neighborhood dispute. He had also been accused of thefts and intimidation. The most serious charge came in 2017, when he was indicted for rape. That case was still pending when the tram shooting occurred. Later, in 2020, the Utrecht District Court convicted him of that offense, though by then it no longer added prison time, because he had already been sentenced to life. Tanis's criminal record, however, is only part of the background. To understand the assessment later made in court, we need to look at his psychological profile. When psychiatrists and psychologists examined him after the tram attack, they painted a consistent picture. Tanis struggled with substance addiction, using cannabis and cocaine heavily. He had a personality disorder with narcissistic and antisocial traits. His intelligence was rated as low, meaning he had difficulty with complex reasoning and long-term planning. The experts concluded he was diminished in responsibility, but not psychotic. In practice, this meant that while his disorders influenced his behavior, he was not detached from reality and could still be held legally accountable. Experts also noted that Tanis showed little empathy for others and a tendency to externalize blame. He was quick to anger, suspicious of authority, and unable to maintain stable work or personal relationships. These traits had been visible for years, even in small conflicts with neighbors or social workers. In interviews, he often portrayed himself as the victim of society, incapable of reflecting on his own actions. In Dutch criminal law, a finding of diminished responsibility does not erase accountability. Instead, it recognizes that mental disorders contributed to the person's behavior, but it still means they are considered able to make choices and understand the consequences. For that reason, Tanis was held fully accountable. By early 2019, his personal situation had collapsed further. He had been evicted from his apartment, was unemployed, and lived on the margins of Utrecht society. His family ties had fractured, leaving him isolated. Social workers and police were familiar with him, but no single intervention had changed his trajectory. A man repeatedly brought before Dutch courts for serious crimes, yet still present on the streets of Utrecht. The legal system had identified him as dangerous, but its processes had not contained him. What stands out in this background is not a single failure, but an accumulation. Years of criminal behavior, a pending rape case, a record of addiction, and documented psychological instability. The court experts concluded he was not insane and not detached from reality. He was a man shaped by disorder, resentment, and isolation, yet still capable of deliberate, planned violence. Those conditions set the stage for what would unfold in Utrecht on 18th of March 2019. That morning, Utrecht's tram system carried its usual flow of commuters. At around 10:45 a.m., police received reports of gunfire inside a tram near 24 October Plein in the district of Kanalanailand. Witnesses later described scenes of confusion and panic as passengers scrambled to escape. Several testified that the shooter, Gökmen Tanis, shouted "Allahu Akbar" while firing. 3 people were killed instantly. Others were wounded, some critically. One of those injured, a 74-year-old man, would die days later in hospital. Tanis had been living in Overvecht, in the north of Utrecht. That morning, he traveled south to Kanalanailand. It was there at 24 October Plein that he boarded the tram and opened fire. After the shooting, he fled using a red Renault Clio, which he had stolen earlier that day. The vehicle was later found abandoned on Tikelarslaan in the neighborhood of Ondiep, northwest of the city center. Within minutes, Dutch authorities launched a large-scale emergency response. The National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism and Security, NCTV, raised the threat level for the province of Utrecht to level 5, the highest possible. It was the first and only time a Dutch province has ever been placed at this level since the system was created. The rest of the country remained at level 4. An NL alert was sent to all mobile phones in the Utrecht area, warning residents to stay indoors and avoid public spaces. Public transport in Utrecht was heavily disrupted. Trams were halted across the city, trains were stopped at Utrecht Central, and bus services were limited under police control. Schools, offices, and public buildings closed as a precaution. Major roads and train stations were sealed off. For several hours, the usually busy city of Utrecht was suspended. Helicopters circled overhead, and heavily armed police were deployed at strategic locations. Patrols were visible in residential districts, at transport hubs, and near government buildings. The stay indoors recommendation was repeated in national broadcasts. During this period, additional forces were called in. Alongside the Utrecht Police and the DSI, the Royal Netherlands Marechaussee was mobilized. Their units secured airports, government buildings, and infrastructure, while some detachments were sent into Utrecht to provide backup to local police. Dutch outlets, including NOS and NRC, reported Marechaussee patrols at Schiphol Airport and later in the city, highlighting how the threat was treated as a national emergency. Attention quickly focused on identifying and capturing the suspect. Within hours, police released Tanis's photograph to the public. His name was already familiar to authorities because of his criminal history and ongoing rape case. At the same time, forensic investigators examined the red Renault Clio left behind in Ondiep. Inside the vehicle, they discovered a handwritten note in which Tanis wrote that he acted for Allah. This document, combined with the witness accounts of him shouting Allahu Akbar in the tram, led prosecutors to treat the case as a possible terrorist attack. Yet the experts and judges pointed out that Tanis had little knowledge of theology or structured ideology. His use of religious language appeared to be a way of framing his anger and frustration, rather than evidence of deep radicalization. In other words, ideology gave shape to the violence, but it was not its root cause. Investigators also considered other motives. Early speculation suggested he might have been targeting a specific woman, possibly an ex-partner. However, the investigation and later the court determined there was no evidence of a personal link to any of the victims. The shootings were indiscriminate. During the manhunt, police conducted raids at several addresses connected to Tanis. One of the most notable was on Trumanlaan in Kanalanailand, where tactical units forced entry. Other searches took place in Overvecht, the neighborhood where he had been living. Streets were cordoned off. Residents were instructed to stay inside, and heavily armed officers patrolled the city. After nearly 7 hours, the search ended. In the early evening, around 6 p.m., Tanis was located at a building on Oudenaarde, just north of Utrecht's city center. Armed units surrounded the address. He was arrested without resistance and was found carrying the firearm believed to have been used in the tram. Immediately afterward, the NCTV lowered the threat level in Utrecht back to level 4. Public transport gradually resumed, and the lockdown was lifted. but the shock of the day remained. In the days that followed, police and prosecutors pieced together the events of 18th of March. Forensic evidence from the Tram confirmed the shooting lasted just over 2 minutes. Ballistics matched the weapon recovered at the time of arrest. Witnesses provided testimony about Tanis's actions and the words he shouted. The handwritten note found in the Clio was a crucial piece of evidence. In it, Tanis declared his act was for Allah. Together with his words inside the Tram, prosecutors used this to argue for a terrorist motive. The court ultimately ruled that the attack was indeed a terrorist act. The reasoning was that Tanis's intent was to spread fear among the public and to target random individuals. Although his extremist framing lacked theological depth, the judges concluded it was deliberate and central to his choice of action. Inside the Utrecht District Court, judges described the attack as cold-blooded and terrorist in nature, concluding only life imprisonment was proportionate. Outside court, the country revisited the fundamental question the case left behind. How did a person repeatedly flagged for violence, addiction, and instability remain in public circulation? Why didn't the accumulation of police files, a pending sex offense case, and clinical risk translate into effective containment?